Stop audio. Okay, we should be good to go. Curt, you want to make the intro?
Hello, everyone. This is Curt Doolittle, Martin Steppen, and Francis Hu from the Natural Law Institute. This is our, I don't know, bi-weekly or so Q&A session where you
More or
submit
less.
questions.
More or
What?
less bi-weekly. In
More
the
or less.
last couple of months, because
Yes.
scheduling and so on, we've been doing tri-weekly. And then next time when this thing lands, it'll be convention time. So I guess we're not going to have this for a few weeks.
Well, it's because we have our conference coming up.
Yes.
So anyway, we try to do these with some regularity. There's a link. There will be a link in the video below where you can post your questions. The questions get harder and harder over time. Um, so uh, uh, anyway, so we do these with regularity and we post them as Q&A sessions. So usually what happens is that I don't really know how I used to know how the process worked. I guess either Francis or Martin reviews the questions, then Martin goes through and answers them, and then basically I respond to Martin's because they're usually pretty much right. So because I want to usually add I want to systematically integrate into whatever the answers are into our work. All right, so with no, is that enough of an introduction? Can we start now? So Francis, you're going to read
Yeah.
the question?
I'll read the first question. So could Curt provide an example of a fine artist he admires and one he does not, along with reasons for his choices?
This is a really interesting question. That it seems simple on its surface, um, and I would say that there are uh, sets of fine artists in every age, even this one, surprisingly, that I would admire, and there are those that I would not. Uh, but I don't. But if you want to say there's a difference between my judgment as someone who understands the theory of art about what is good art and what is bad, and what I admire. What I generally admire might be different from, in other words, it's too narrow. It's my preference is too narrow to give an insight into what is good, right? So I tend to view things with extraordinary investment, basically detail, and in insight. In other words, I look at essentially just like what is the thing about the monkey can tell the difference between the grape and the other thing, whatever. Martin, do you remember what that is? The monkey can tell the difference between the value of a grape and the value of a cashew or something like that. I don't remember. So we noticed this because we
That's
first
from the,
what?
is it from the experiment where two monkeys got different things and one got angry?
Yes, exactly. So we knew this. I actually knew this when I was a kid because they'd studied squirrels. How squirrels could tell the caloric difference between foods. And so my preference is essentially technical, which is how much depth is there in the scale, the content, and the art, the craftsmanship that is and scale, content, which is the meaning, design, and which is the aesthetics, and the craftsmanship, and put it together. So that's a technical explanation. And so a lot of things would fit into that, but I'd be afraid if I just said, well, this particular painter, this particular sculptor, this particular um, potter, even that I thought those people were examples, that it would be that would convey too much bias on my part when there's quite a bit of variation. For example, I happen to really like Mark Rothko, who just uses these big color experiments where there's a big painting and there's like a background with a, a rectangular color on the top, like the head size, and a squarer color on the bottom over it. And he's basically playing with colors. And technically, is this art? Well, it's decoration. It's technically proficient. It shows that he has a lot of insight. But is that art high art in the sense that we mean it? So that, probably not. If we go back to Monet's colors, use of colors, he was working in a time where photography had come about, and artists were trying to separate themselves from the fact that their ability to correctly render a scene had been basically discounted by photography, and so they were trying to add more aesthetic content to it. So I say that as great stuff because it's an innovation. It required insight and technical understanding and craftsmanship. So right then there's this thing as well, but are these things have meaning? Like a Chartres Cathedral has meaning along with it. It represents time, space, extraordinary investment that we are capable of making at this age in our this time in our lives as a polity. So it has extraordinary craftsmanship, design, architectural, basically scientific skill behind it. So I look at all those things. So when we say what do we like, well, or see what do I admire? I admire a certain thing. Now, if I were to flip that around and say that I would admire, let's say, Medal Mobius, the guy who you probably know him as the guy who designed the spacesuits from Alien, right? But he produced an extraordinary number of comic books. Are they really comics? I don't know. They're way too deep for a comic, but they're adventures in basically metaphysical thought.
I think the new term for those are graphics novels.
Right.
Like Japanese mangas are a form of graphics novels.
Correct. And so he's one of the people that started that, and his peer, whose name Enki Bilal is this French, very French thing, started this stuff, and it's sort of gone onward from there. So when you look at that, I could look at any field and say this is good, this is bad, or whatever. The thing I would get across to you is that I already told you how to. I've written, written this up a number of times. Is to you can actually tell whether art is impressive or not just by the criteria I just gave you to measure them. Is what's the amount of investment? Usually, scale matters quite a bit. Even though when I buy art myself, or when I used to buy art myself, I buy mezzotints. The mezzotints are sort of the the ultimate version of engraving, with printing, right? Printing and engraving. They're extremely difficult to make. They take a very long time to make, and I find them incredibly rich and beautiful because you start with scratching the whole thing and then removing the scratches rather than putting the scratches in. That makes sense. And so what you do, you just start with a dark background and you add lightness. And you can go back and forth with it. And so and then you put the thing in acid multiple times, just what you can do that with other kinds of etching as well. So what you end up with is this very beautiful thing. But is it high art? No. And so when I say high art, what does that mean? It means it fulfills all the criteria that I had, the most important of which being meaning, and meaning being what you say when you say something has durable political, social, emotional, spiritual value that was created in a context in a period of time, so that we see through time the achievements of man's arts as producing cultural artifacts. But then, is it your daughter's drawing of a horse head art? No, it's craft, right? It's an attempt, it's design, but it isn't high art. Is most student work art? No, it's actually shit. Um, um, is most of the art you find in galleries art? Not really. Most of it's pretty bad. And there's economics behind it. Why is that it's very hard to make those four criteria of material investment, and it could be scale, quality, whatever. Material investment, um, uh, content, uh, aesthetics, and craftsmanship. It's very hard to do those things because they're all freaking expensive. And so we've made the cost of people really costly with modernity. And so any art that's any good is prohibitively expensive, not only to purchase, but to create. So what's happened is essentially the only place we're creating art is, well, not anymore, even was the movies. And now it's not happening much at all, except for a very small number of cases. My college girlfriend still sells her work. I mean, it's you call it abstract art, scribbly bits and stuff, which was fashionable when we were in school in the 80s and has continued to be saleable today. But it's really it's really design. It's not high art.
Hey, Curt, this actually led me to a question. So I posted a link in the chat there. There's a particular type of painting in the Tibetan region called a tanka.
Say again?
There's a particular type of painting, religious painting, in the Tibetan region called tanka. So I take a look at the link I sent you. So do you consider this high art or fine art? There was a time when these religious paintings were produced purely for the monks and religious, and it essentially embeds the essence of the Tibetan Buddhism culture.
Right.
These days, they're essentially mass produced for tourists.
Right.
But when you look at the amount of work that they put in, well, it depends on the workmanship, obviously, but the amount of work that put into one of these paintings, it could be enormous.
Right. So let's do it. Let's take the example. It's a thanga, right? So Thangka, and should remind you a little bit, if you're in the arts at all, of Byzantine art, right, and of Hindu art, which is that they use they use flatness, right, and extraordinary detail. Whereas in the European tradition, we started with the Egyptians through the Greeks, we use dimensionality, three-dimensionality, and representationalism. So that helps show that there are two different ambitions. They're right. While you might say it's more technically difficult to produce three-dimensionality, which is certainly true, that doesn't necessarily tell us anything other than that's the European direction versus the direction it's taking here. Okay, so first, these are less expensive to produce, right? In other words, the materials. It's sort of like if you look at Hindu jewelry, it's made with incredibly cheap stuff, right? But they use a lot of detail. Or if you look at what's the temples in Angkor Wat, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right. That's
the
incredible.
relief carvings, every square inch of the building is hand carved by somebody. It's very impressive.
Now let's go with German design at the other end. If you've seen German design, it's minimalist, right? And so it's very, it's where Bauhaus comes from, or the modern view of art.
I was going to say Bauhaus.
Right. So when you look at these paintings, these Tibetan paintings, what criteria is there? Is there content, meaning? Well, yeah, they're dense with meaning, right? I mean, it's incredibly dense meaning. Uh, is that meaning representative of an era or time in which these things were originally thought to be excellences?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So criteria one is solved. Criteria two, um, are they aesthetically solved? Right. In other words, is there an aesthetic design to them? Are they intentionally designed around one of the sensory perception of the human mind, in which is the most common is triangular. In other words, there's a triangular relationship in them. Matter of fact, you'll find all of them are either circular or triangular or both.
And
So
some kind of symmetry, especially the
correct,
circular ones.
right? The now so that's the composition. Now look at the use of color. I mean, it's vibrant, it's bright, it's quite lovely, really.
And I was talking to an artist when I was traveling that region. So all the yellowish gold paint you
Yes.
see there apparently is real gold powder, which is why it lasts.
So, so we have okay. That's actually jumps ahead. But if you look at the design of these things, it's incredibly well thought out. There is the hard for us as Europeans is because our sense of color originates in the Western tradition. So we would consider this stuff gaudy, right? But it's not. But in their tradition, it's actually, in other words, uh, the a Greek statue, right, of a form is simple, clean elegance, right? That's what it's meant to do with the skill represented in that sense. When I look at this, what I see is they're using these colors to create a huge contrast, an almost mystical experience that separates the. I mean, if you from that part of the world, it's not colorful.
The,
That part was
the,
very colorful.
What? What?
the
What?
Greek Roman statues were originally colored.
Yes.
The marble ones?
Yeah, they were painted. That's the reason you use the anyway. So uh, so where am I getting to? So the that was the that's so from a design perspective, they deal with symmetry, composition, um, uh, uh, and coloration, and they even handle texture. So then that's the next step. That's pretty good. Now the next one is craftsmanship. Is it hard to create these colors, mix them together, and apply them in these forms? Today it's not, but back then it was, right? So yes, that's quite good. And if you look at their line composition, the variation of the styles used, there is a stylistic approach to Eastern art that is not as common in Western art. So there's a little stylistic coherence there, um, but so that's sort of like Egyptian stylistic coherence. It's common for their culture. So if I look at this by all the criteria, which is the meaning embodied in it, the uh, aesthetics in its composition, the craftsmanship in its execution, and the materials or the investment in the thing, that's pretty good high art at the time. Well, if I make a million copies of the Mona Lisa and put them on the wall, is that still art? Well, that's decoration, right? The Mona Lisa is art, and this stuff is decoration. Are these by copying something? Is that art? Well, that's the thing. Is that when you say something is art, you're saying that in its given it's the author the intent. In other words, what am I trying to make here? Is it a profound statement or is it something beautiful? I mean, you know, can I make a beautiful hairbrush? I mean, this thing is a piece of art technically, right? I mean, it's designed for its time. It's so um, so when I look at these values, I would say, well, there's things that are things that are still craft, things that are still design, things that are still decoration, things that are still decorative arts, things that are still uh, uh, editorial arts, things that are still fine arts, and things that are still high arts, and you just have this spectrum, and you can judge it by those things. The only difference, only thing I try to get across to people that's hard when you're comparing things across time is you have to sort of look at a thing and say, well, at the time Giacometti was producing his work, it was pretty innovative. And at the time Rothko was producing his art, it was pretty innovative. But at the time they were producing the Kouros boy in Greece, that was pretty innovative. So when you look, it just means that the Kouros boy is the one that's still standing straight, but one foot is ahead of the other. Um, so one foot is ahead of the other. Yeah. So that's before they got into the weight shifting, where you get the contrapposto stance, where if you move one foot, then your hips tilt and then your shoulders tilt. So this you have to look at a thing in the context of how much of an achievement is it for the period it represents, and how unique is it in representing that period. That's the fifth criterion. So you can judge all art you want. I mean, I've thought I should be given how much interest in this. If I want, I would love to spend 90 days putting together that essay into online course. I don't want a course, but class in how to judge art, so that people would get habituate those 4+1 dimensions. And if they did, then they would be able to look at art across the spectrum and sort of say, okay, I see why this is good or not. For example, I happen to like Botero's, I think it's Fernando Botero's use of people. If you look it up, Botero, and he makes these very round, almost cartoonish like people. I think they're cute. My favorite artist is still Bruegel, and he makes all those dancing peasant scenes in the Middle Ages and from the Low Countries, and I think that's my favorite stuff. Well, why is that? Because it's fucking joy by simple people, and they're adorable. And he has lots of little figures doing these competent things. I think that's my favorite period.
Wait, did Bruegel also paint the Tower of Babel? I see a painting that looks like the Tower of Babel here.
Yes. Well, he painted a lot, really. I mean, but and so him and his father, there's two of them that paint these things. Bruegel the younger and Bruegel the elder. So if you look at these pieces, they're quite charming. So it's sort of like this might be contentious, but so when you first look at other cultures' art, it can look ugly to you until you sort of understand where they're coming from. It's like understanding what they're trying to do there. And what I like about what I teach is that it lets you look at cultures differently. It's the same thing as like when you look at people from different ethnicities, different races, they don't look quite right to you. But it's like, for example, I think the Jamon people in northern Japan are the men in particular are incredibly fucking handsome, right? But how did I get there? Well, I get there by looking at phenotypes around mankind and understanding what the group is sort of expressing in their phenotype. And you find that pretty much there's beautiful people in every group according to the group standard. And I don't mean to be a relativist. I just mean that you can understand and appreciate things. And you can do that in arts as well, and it's not mysterious. It may be difficult to develop the visual vocabulary so that you can make decisions about art, right? Because you need to see enough of it and understand the way I teach to decompose it and judge it. You can do that because that gets over your intuition's just habitual reaction to some whatever art you see. unless you say, okay, let me understand it. Once I understand it, then I can intuit it on its terms. I mean, I started my first philosophy is art, right? I mean, that's what I did first. All right. So did I answer that question well enough? I didn't directly answer the question because I don't want to. If you want to, what's his name there? Swan artist. I can't quite pull it up. Who paints swans, and women with wings? Can't pull it up. Oh, I can't pull it up. I feel really embarrassed and gestures. He's very, I wouldn't call him a sort of he's got a mythicism to him. Can't find one. It's so obvious. I mean, you'll know if you know anything of, here it is. No, that's not one.
Water Cray?
No. Oh, came close. This one's close. What's this one? Yeah, so he's being copied now. Deviant art is all over the place now with this stuff. So anyway, I would bring it up if I'll tell you about it later if I think about it. But I think it's called he's basically does fantasy, and it's basically a kind of it's pseudo religious, pseudo mythological realism.
Are you talking about Boris Vallejo?
No, Boris. I know Boris. No, Boris is from an older generation. This guy's working today. Anyway, don't you won't find it easily. And I can't believe Michael Parks. That's what it is. I knew it would come to me. Parkes. Michael Parks. Yes, that's him. And so if you looked at, he's sort of like the modern reinterpretation of combining Greek, Roman, medieval, and Romantic period art in himself. And his work is extraordinary. He does sculpture as well, but his painting is absolutely gorgeous. And so I find this really beautiful myself. Would I hang it in my house? You know what I had in my house? I had paintings of English hunting scenes. I had huge etching of an old oak tree. I had lots of little mezzotents. And so because the reason is because in art, I'm interested in line, which is basically drawing. And so I'm fascinated by line. It's possibly because I'm not very good with color. So I tend to appreciate people who are exceptionally good with line. Anyway, so I think I've killed that question.
I'm looking at Michael Parks' painting. Some of his painting reminds me of Salvador Dali.
Yeah, well, Dali will use distortion, and this guy is more into using classical symbolism and realism. It's actually hyperrealism.
That's the thing I was talking about, like the hyper-realistic aspects.
Yes. And so I value that kind of work. For example, his name is going to escape me too. God. If I'm in the context, I can remember them like that. And when I'm outside, it takes me a long time outside the context. So when we're talking about, there's an artist who paints portraits. Unfortunately, and they're huge. They're like 10 feet tall and 6 or 8 feet wide. I mean, they're enormous, and they're usually of ugly people. And what he does is he just starts out with a grid, and in every grid, there's like a background color circle. Inside of that circle is another medium color and a foreground color. And so he's sort of imitating what printing does,
Mm.
which is a sort of pixelated type of thing, what we call it pixelating today in computers.
Oh, like he's painting like dot matrix.
Right. And so they're hyper realistic. Excuse me. I'm pretty asthma, Matt, I think. Chuck Close, that's his name. Would I hang that stuff in my house? No. I don't like ugly people. There's an awful lot. There's an awful lot of bad art. You know, I call shock or attention seeking or vulgar art. And this is basically entertainment for the foot traffic to get people who don't understand art in the door. The truth is, the people who understand art are owned by galleries, so to speak. And so they buy it seriously. Once I became wealthy enough to really afford expensive art, I no longer had an interest in it. Don't explain that to me. I have no fucking idea.
All right, shall we move on?
Yes. Jesus. I've been listening to Jordan Peterson try to justify his mythicism this morning with what's his guy? The guy's name that runs The Skeptic. And so I might be choking on a little remembrance of that. Sorry.
All right, so question number 2. From an admirer of NLI's work. 1, granted, at least very useful and possibly essential that the NLI get the Christians on board, especially in the USA. 2, to that end, muscular Christianity to be promoted. Thanks to John. 3, still, given Christianity's likely role in the fall of Rome, e.g., there is clearly real danger here. Especially problematic will be members of the NLI leadership who choke when things heat up and fail to pull the appropriate triggers when the time comes because of unconscious Christian condition. 4, a proposal with 3 in mind use abortion infanticide as a litmus test, at the very least among the leadership. Clearly, anyone who treats preserving the life of unborn and just born as absolute moral imperatives is thinking like a woman. Ancient patriarchal societies, including ancient Judea and even early Christendom, saw abortion infanticide as not only sometimes necessary but even healthy and humane. Only a woman will want to preserve unborn or just born life regardless of cost, just as clearly as a core duty of man to overcome that female instinct for the sake of society at large, and thus litmus test will be, in effect, a test against a failure to give eugenics an essential place it must have if we are to recover from a biological, psychological, and social degeneracy caused primarily by philosophical naive industrialization. 5, NB. 4 has nothing to do with a modern debate about women's right to choose. In a healthy patriarchy, a healthy woman impregnated by a healthy man would in most cases not be allowed by the state to abort the child, and likewise a street-dwelling drug addict who has no idea who the father is will be compelled to abort, etc. That is one question.
I don't understand if there's a question in there. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, there isn't actually a question in here, but I'll at least comment that I'm sympathetic to the pro-life view precisely because modern abortionists are promoting it at best to enable irresponsibility and at worst to lower the numbers of lives, and their arguments demonstrate a total lack of overtime thinking, inability to think of fetus as anything but what it is at the moment, with no regard for potential it carries. until the argument moves away from giving choice to people not qualified to make such a choice to eugenics, the pro-life position is far preferable. I'm also happy to call leftists just clumps of cells, but no longer having the potential that fetus carried.
Well,
brilliant.
most radical leftists just clump themselves no longer have. Oh my God, Martin, that's genius. That's genius.
That is genius. You gotta make it into the meme.
Damn. Wow, I was thinking straight about something else, what I was going to contribute. Now I'm thrown. You know, the stuff you come up with, despite that English isn't your first language, kills me. I mean, if we could teach like 3/4 of Americans to be as good with the English language as you have, can you imagine how much better off the country would be? I just think that's humorous. And you, wait a minute, I want to say this. How did you learn to speak English?
Well, I'm not gonna claim school didn't actually help. It did, but just watching stuff on the internet, downloading movies, playing video games, and interacting later.
Yep. Anyway, okay, so where the hell were we? Okay, so I got to get my head back around this question. Okay, so the first, granted, at least very useful and possibly essential, is that an NLI get the Christians on board. There's a difference between not dismissing and pandering. Right, those are two end. So you could be dismissive, non-dismissive, inclusive, and then pandering. And so the problem is that you have the social media has created a sort of inverse mirror, just a mirror image, a reflection, an inversion of mainstream media. And then mainstream was an attempt to create political coherence, even if it was in the wrong direction, starting with the 1960s invasion of media by the Jewish left. But before that, it was simply another vehicle like the priesthood had been, which was, and the education has been, which was then a vehicle for maintaining social coherence and integration, full integration into the Anglo or at least Western tradition. Anglo-Germanic Western, it should be that sequence. And so the problem is that just as there's a problem in our organization with we listen too much to a tiny fragment of people who are not going to make any difference at all, there's a problem online in general of listening to a tiny group of people, Christians who aren't going to matter at all. And the reason is the people that are that doubled down on something are not the people that have succeeded in obtaining responsibility and for self, family, job, and etc. in reality. And so there's a tendency for us to overestimate this. When we say that we want to bring in Christians, if you mean Southern evangelists, that's great. If you mean the majority of Christians, well, I mean, I consider myself a Christian, even though most Christians would deny it. I might be a traditional Christian or a philosophical Christian, even if I'm not a fundamentalist. But there are fundamentalists out there, but you have to look at the data. You know, we're very close to hitting that point where while the vast majority of Americans still believe in God, this is an abstract, almost natural law concept of God, whereas the fundamentalists, they believe in the literality of the religious tradition, and some of them in the literality of heaven and angels and whatever those other creatures and demons and things are. But when you look at the data, that number of people who deeply believe is less than 20% of the population very soon. And it's going to continue to decline with every generation because religious fundamentalism requires not only a personality type, in other words, you have to have a more empathizing than systematizing rather, but you have to be indoctrinated. And as indoctrination becomes more and more difficult, fundamentalism becomes harder and harder to have. So what we see is the most fundamentalists are the lowest IQ group. I can't remember what they're called now. I mean, I used to be able to name the factions, but basically Christian denominations are organized by IQ, with the most fundamentalist, the most rigorous being at the bottom, and the least fundamentalist and most philosophically moral and traditional at the top. So I don't think that it's necessarily true that it helps to pander to Christianity if that means pandering to the fundamentalists. I think instead what our position is, or my position is, and I would like the broader institution's position is that it's more important that we preserve the European traditions of religions, not that the ancient world traditions exist anymore, but certainly the Germanic pagan, Scandinavian pagan, Celtic pagan, Scandinavian. We have these pagan traditions that survive in our hearth religion, which we would call myths and fairy tales and whatever. We have our heroes in our traditions, I mean, our traditional heroes. We have heroes from across the world. I mean, there's no shortage of incorporating other civilizations' great thinkers into the Western tradition. And we certainly have enough nature worship left in us, which is relatively obvious. And we certainly have enough Christian ethics, which realistically is so metaphysically ingrained in Europeans. Even when you talk to these heathens, these pagans, these whatever they are, they don't realize that the thing that they're advertising is still metaphysically Christian. So my view is, the point is to say, there's a difference between saying you must believe as we do, because it's not possible, and you must carry the values we do, great, and versus you may not live among us if you don't carry the same values we do that are incorporated in these religions, because all religions are condensations of group evolutionary strategies. And Jesus. And these other religions tend to be, and certainly are demonstrating that they are, hostile to our group evolutionary strategy. And unfortunately, while we're working on popularizing it, group evolutionary strategies are largely unconscious. So it's hard to defend them except by this moral intuition that something is wrong or people are bad. So what we're trying to do, just as I tried to do with art a few moments ago, is give people the language and the means by which to understand our group evolutionary strategy and articulate in rational terms why these other religions' group evolutionary strategies are not only hostile to us, but some of them are hostile to mankind. Kind of hard to argue with Buddhism, but I mean, in some way, it's hard to argue with Hinduism, except it's so fucking crazy, it's incomprehensible by anyone. But it's pretty hard to argue with Confucianism and Taoism. But it's really easy to argue with Judaism and Islam. And it's pretty easy to argue against fundamentalist Christianity. It's, however, most easy to argue for Stoicism and after that Buddhism, because they're basically just cognitive behavioral therapy that you practice on yourself. So so if we ritualized those things, we would produce the suppression of neuroticism and anxiety that all these other religions exist to produce, and we would do so without infringing upon our group evolutionary strategy, whether it be the minor infringement on truth and reality that Christianity imposes are the vast difference between Jewish amoralism and Muslim devolutionary immoralism. So I don't. My position would be it's not. We don't need to necessarily adopt the 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 things the Christians say so much as largely you're right on these terms, but not for the reasons you say, but for the reasons that are more, but because we can explain the things you're right about in rational and scientific terms. So I hope I should have killed that one too. That should be good. A good answer.
Well, I mean, some people obviously need those simple and personified explanations.
Yes.
That's fine. You're just not going to have political influence.
No, we can't. It's perfectly. I mean, it's hard to argue with somebody who's highly empathic, right? In other words, they're highly embodied, so that social information, emotional information is very influential to them and very meaningful to them, whereas abstract systemic information is not. It's like a whisper to them. So, and that where they're dependent more on how they're treated by and the information provided by others than they are by themselves. Those people need fundamentalism for clarity, to provide them with decidability, to provide them defense against suggestions that would encourage their immorality, which they know is wrong. So, I mean, they're not wrong to want that. It's only wrong to say that we can treat everybody, give everybody the same set of tools given their composition. What we can do, of course, is we can educate more people in physical fitness, mindfulness, manners, ethics, and morals, and in doing so, restore enough homogeneity that the pressure to find a religion to compensate for the feeling of chaos and alienation, undecidability, and in many cases inferiority, is mollified by other means. And so our general argument with religion is that religion is very cheap and training is very expensive, that we have brought about education under the assumption that the training that was provided by religion through repetition and oral practice would continue without the education, without decline, and education could continue to fulfill its niche. Instead, what's happened is that faith has largely collapsed, and the ability to have faith has largely collapsed. So what we haven't done is we haven't brought in an alternative that gives people the tools by which to serve the purpose that religion serves, which is creating a standard of behavior that creates a standard weight and measurement for decision behavior, to judge yourself and to judge others, and to systematically suppress the capacity for others to impose guilt, shame, and other emotions upon you in order to match their ambitions, rather than for you to continue to pursue moral ambitions independent of their suggestion, persuasion, or coercion by guilt, insult, ridicule, ostracization, etc.
I would say that education is religion, and because we try to separate them, just like we try to separate culture and religion, we just open up spaces for hostile religion to enter.
Exactly, which is exactly what happened, right? So, I mean, I actually agree with that position. If you say religion has to be supernatural, that's actually false, because if it were true, then you wouldn't have the Confucian success it had, or the early Buddhist success it had, because Buddhism originally was pretty philosophical, even if it was using that strange, goofy metaphysical woo-woo that Hindus were working with at the time, which I guess is forgivable given at their time. So it's not necessary. What is necessary is a heroic mythology and a moral mythology, and I think that's constructible basically in any culture.
Yeah, I mean, we have just history, great man of history.
Mm-hmm.
That's mythology.
Yep.
And again, we didn't have a monopoly on interpreting our history. We let enemies interpret our history.
Yes. All right. Next question.
Somebody asked on the chat, is it possible that a neo-Marcionism, if I pronounce that right, might break out, a Christianity moving away from Torah and the Tanakh?
Well, it already has. What do you think Marxism is? It's
No, not Marxism.
Marcionism.
what?
Marcionism.
Marcionism, right? Or I don't think you can look at the past and find anything to learn from there. You can learn that despite despite the existence of Confucianism and Taoism and what came before, which I can't remember.
Marcion is the one who made the first canon, and he looked at the Old Testament and concluded that God, Yahweh, is evil and cannot possibly be the same one as in the New Testament.
Yes, which is true. I agree. So, which is a very common argument made that we've heard repeatedly throughout history is take away the Old Testament, take away all the crap, start with the four Gospels, united them into one story, which I think the last one does, right? And there you have that in the Sermon on the Mount. That's all you need to know.
Oh, I mean, right. You're just describing the Jeffersonian Bible.
Yeah, exactly. I'm describing the Jeffersonian Bible.
Just live all the rules and walking on water shit, and then you're pretty much good.
Marcion didn't take that out. I think that all of the Gospels didn't even exist at the time. His own Gospel of Marcion was, I think, a version of Luke that was without the references to the Old Testament, something like that.
Well, I think that, at the time, you have to look at it as we for some reason we think Judaism and Christianity are older than the Greeks, and they're not. They're reactions to the Greeks. And so if you look at the conquest of the old world and the spread of literacy and the Greek spread of philosophy and knowledge, it's like the old argument that what did the Library of Alexandria consist of? Mostly commentary on the epic cycle, which the fragments we have are the Iliad, the Odyssey, and basically Homer's works. So they were trying to produce a Semitic underclass hero to compete with the Greek aristocratic hero. And once you sort of see that going on, that's obvious. As I was listening to Peterson this morning, again wanting to strangle him, I'm like, why, if you had that, if you have the Greek tradition, why do you even give a shit about this primitive freaking desert underclass barbarian religion? I mean, I don't get it at all. I can't comprehend why you would even give that. It's a negative reactionary movement against the Greek evolution of thought and the Indo-European greater success than the old world had had. And so I just don't get it. I get it in that it's habitually indoctrinated. I get it in that it's easier to say the world, God must serve me because I'm at the bottom, than it is to say I've got to defeat the world, which is the Greek model. I understand that that's easier, but Jesus, there's if you want wisdom, read the Greeks. So I just, it's frustrated me for a long time. Martin said something there I wanted to comment on. But anyway, so they were trying to build an alternative to the Bible is bigger and deeper, so they can, as thoroughly as possible, replace the European tradition that was destroying their mythology and destroying their the ability to use their history and their mythology and their supernaturalism as the binding property of their peoples. And so I get it, but the same thing as Marxism. What's Marxism? It's an attempt to undermine the European restoration and development of systemic thought. And so Marxism is, again, it's another regressive religion, this time in pseudoscientific and rationalist form, instead of the Christian religion, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim religions, which are in supernatural form. They're both seditions against basically Indo-European aristocracy, and which is, I think the Chinese are right to go out and call it a mental illness and get rid of it because they're right.
Well, I mean, they called Muslim Islam a mental illness and try to get rid of it because that where they reside, right? That's a part of China, well,
Yes.
modern day China, but it used to be the barbarian lands that China has been at war with and so on for millennia. So when they see this hostile religion developing the place, of course they want to nip it in the bud.
And they're right. The problem is
But the problem is the Chinese are still straddled with the modern version of that religion system, which is Marxism. I mean, I don't think any of the CCP leadership actually believes in Marxism anymore, especially given the last 30 years of capitalism and whatever, right? But they use it as essentially using it as a tool to justify their rule.
Yes. Well, I mean, okay. Well, I mean, you're the one who always brings up the bad emperor problem. Well, I mean, it's the same fucking issue, right, over and over again. Anyway, so
Yeah, you have a risk of getting a bad emperor under monarchy. You'll never get a good ruler under democracy. At least you have a chance of a good emperor.
unfortunately, that's true. Though the thing is, what do you mean democracy? Is like, well, I'm not against participatory government as the British invented it, which was that, okay, well, if we want to raise money, we need their permission. If we want to enact a law, we need their permission. That doesn't seem bad. It's when you can get people into office who have agendas, right? You have this particular game going on, and there's nobody you can say that's enough, right? And which, unfortunately, whatever. I don't want to go sideways. All right, so I think we've answered this question, number 2. Is it 2 we just answered? Or no, it was 3. The guy
No,
just
this is 2.
it was in chat.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, the 2.5. Okay, let's move on. Question number 3. How does Noblesse Oblige fit into the framework of natural law? Curt and Martin seems to have different ideas on this point. If the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, that suggests that the Noblesse Oblige doesn't exist and the strong can oppress the weak as much as they like, so long as it is stable over time. The same argument could be made for the permissibility of driving animals to extinction if doing so does not harm us. On the other hand, if a statement is false, then the strong can be considered stewards of the weak, with some duty of caretaking. Are both perspectives equally valid?
It's a misunderstanding of my position. Just like Thucydides, who I was quoting there, it's a descriptive statement, not a prescriptive one. And just like the context of his quote, it was about strong groups versus weak groups, not about individuals who are necessarily weak when competing with groups. The only real argument there was that if a group wishes to have self-determination in fact rather than by permission, which is to say not at all, it must become strong enough to stop any attempt to deprive it of self-determination. Noblesse Oblige, whether on individual or group level, is about dealing with the weak, those who likely cannot attain self-determination at all, in a way that's good for them, even beyond the limits set by our rule of natural law. I find this obviously desirable for our people, just not something I expect when there's no incentive. Also, I despise the use of word oppression. It can mean 1,000 different things and typically lacks the accounting for how the supposedly oppressed is himself contributing to the interaction. Common use is just to criticize any use of authority, but lower or feminine classes of people are unlikely to be capable of making the best decisions for themselves, in which case providing them with an authority to guide them through life is an example of noblesse oblige that would simultaneously be considered oppression.
You take those two paragraphs, noblesse oblige. I just love that. I mean, that's what it means. That's brilliant.
Okay, do you get it about authority now?
Yeah, I think the problem is there's no word for what I mean. So when you're using the word, I agree with you, as in this context. My problem is I don't know how to get away, because the only alternative is arbitrary discretion.
Let's use that then.
Okay, so that's my. I'm not. You think I'm going to let you win this argument that easy? I mean, I've been holding this argument out with you for at least 6 months. I mean, I could get a little more.
You're pretending that I haven't already won it.
I love you. Okay, so the there's a difference with how would we do it this way? Authority to do what versus authority to enact arbitrary discretion. It's probably that distinction. Okay. Anyway, you're right. I know you're right, but I've known you're right all along. I just don't know how to solve this language problem. And I do, as you know, I get joy out of these little things, playing with you. So, and the audience knows that. I wish I could talk more about this. I talk about the other two for 20 minutes because I want to add color. I can't do better than your last two paragraphs there. It's not possible. That's beautiful. I'm gonna post that. Okay. Next question, number 4.
Number 4 from John. Well, Bronze Age Pervert is a celebrity in right-wing circles with some substantial young following. What is your stance on him and his usefulness, loyalty to the cause of Western civilization?
I have not read the book yet, nor have I found the time to listen to the podcast, so my opinions are based on his Twitter and what people said about him. My impression is that there's a lot of good one can find in his work, and it's presented in an entertaining way, and it also seems to me accusations made against him have been overstated. There have been things I've disagreed with, which is the same as with any other right-wing influencer, but I haven't seen any good reason to entirely condemn him. Yes, he's partially Jewish, but I can similarly appreciate Paul Gottfried, for example.
I was at lunch with Paul Gottfried and he got mad at me.
What did you tell him?
I explained to him that what he was criticizing the Protestants for wasn't an error or ignorance on their part. It was a deliberate strategy. And that it's hard to know if they were wrong. And it just lit him up like crazy. He wanted to get out of the restaurant. And then we walked a little farther, continued talking it. And then he said, I got to go. And he went down. He's actually really good, but he's a neurotic Jewish guy. He's just what you expect.
You made him too uncomfortable.
What?
You made him too uncomfortable.
I find that that people in these, whether libertarians, whatever, these people who are academics, who've hung their self-image as well as their work and their career, on framing intentionality into others is is a common problem. Um, uh, I don't know. I always think of it as, and we Martin and I tease about this all the time, but I like surrounding myself with people who find fault with the ideas because that forces me to make them better, right? Even if Martin's wrong on authority.
That doesn't work out for this question.
So, but a lot of people in those movements can't, and a lot of Jewish thinkers react highly emotionally when confronted, and that's because they're counting on not only for themselves but for others on that emotional loading and framing being sympathetically adopted. So when two Europeans, masculine Europeans, debate something, and we have different opinions on it, it's not a. It's we might get frustrated with the other person, but it's not personal, right? Whereas, like women, these Jewish intellectuals personalize way too much of everything, especially if they're hyperactivated in on some way. So as for Bronze Age Pervert, I've been following this guy since, I don't know, following is the wrong word. I've been aware of him for a long time. I remember at one point going and reading something he wrote at Yale and thinking I saw what he was doing. It's pretty good, sort of like a new Nietzscheanism. Um, but there was a couple of twists in there which ignore the Western demand for responsibility. And so when I see him, what I see is just that, as I see really good ideas, the new Nietzscheanism. But what I also see is that the abandonment of what we just discussed was Noblesse Oblige, which is the responsibility of those of us who are able to lead and guide those that are not. And so what I take from his position is it's the belief it's not possible to produce that leadership. And I make the same argument to everyone, which is that's only because the right is so fragmented because the left has succeeded in fragmenting us into the factions of fundamentalists, Nazis on one end, and libertarians in the middle, and classical liberals, and this center right and traditionalists. We're also fragmented because there's no standard of measurement left. So I just view it as, okay, I understand, but this is like all those other young macho bullshit things that are like, I'm going to go off on my own and be heroic. Well, great. Wait, let me know how that works for you, because really all of us who get wealthy, we build teams. Anybody who you build teams, you compromise, you work together, you figure things out, you try to find a heroic purpose that you can work on together. And I mean, our organization is a heroic purpose.
Yeah, I can think of no higher heroic purpose than this.
Right. I mean,
saving Western civilization. Are you kidding?
I mean, it sounds insane, but the progress we're making is pretty amazing. So
Yeah.
I don't know. So I would say that hopefully that's a useful. The tendency of people on the right has a kind of reductionism to it, which is the right tends to not look at what a person says and say, this part's good, that part's bad, or this part suits our purpose, this part doesn't, but to try to make a moral judgment about the individual. And that's just impossible. You want to make a moral judgment about Nietzsche? I mean, he's a fucking lunatic, right? Does that mean he didn't produce brilliant things to say? No. How many, I mean, it's like, how many, I mean, it's like, I'm going to use a good example. Arnold Schwarzenegger is still an amazing human being who did a lot in his life, but did he have a weak moment and bang an ugly maid? Yeah, of course, right? So that happens, right? We're all just human. Don't look for this person to be, your heroic, symbolic, virtuous, pure person. Look for that person to have be contributing or not, or if they're contributing. And so what I find is most conservatives saying, conservatives go, you're not exactly like me, so you're bad, or you're not good enough. Where instead of all these guys, it's like Spencer. People still stick, still pick, still pick on Spencer. Why did I have a tongue tie with that? For his brush with Nazism. Well, I mean, at the time, he thought he was doing the right thing. That's how I look at it. It wasn't the right thing, but at the time, he thought he was trying to move the ball forward. If you're trying to move the ball forward politically, I'm going to support that you're trying to move the ball forward. If it doesn't work, that was just a theory that didn't succeed, a test that didn't succeed. Don't try to get everybody to be perfect. Just see how many guys we can get going in the right direction, and that's all.
Most people I follow and interact with have more of a problem with what Spencer became nowadays rather than what he was.
Right. I mean, but that's a personal choice on his part because of the stresses. It's like, what's his name there who makes the guy I like down in New York? I've been on the show a bunch of times.
Stu Peters?
No, it's back in the day. I can't bring it up now. And so the government went after him and they basically ruined him, right? And so when you've been through that, you're like, okay, well, I just don't want that to happen again. So I'm going to walk this way instead of that way. Well, I mean, that's great. What do you want? Do you want these guys to do is get burned? And they got burned because you didn't show up for them. And then you expect them to keep getting burned when you don't show up for them. We had the same problem. Go ahead.
Shall we move on?
Yep.
All right. Question number 5. Less of a question, more of a request. So Curt has alluded numerous times to this grand chart he has full of data on countries around the world. If he makes a copy of it and leaves a link to it for the viewers to see, I would love to write software that automates updating the data onto that chart based on his preferred sources.
You can't, because you have to go to a lot of sources and you have to say, okay, I mean, it's a work. I mean, I usually spend a couple of weeks on it once a year. I haven't done it this year. I usually do it in the summer. I have no idea why. Probably because I want to break and it's nice outside. And the data is from too many sources, and you have to sort of massage it enough to say, okay, these guys are using this measure. And it's like, for example, there's basically 3 groups of IQ measurements, and I can't even figure out where one of them's coming from. And so, because I think they're using another model to use as 0. Anyway, it's 100. And so you have to look at this data. And so if you want to look at, for example, religiosity, that's pretty good. You can find that out. If you want to find ethnographic distribution of polity, that's a pain in the ass because you got to go to 20 sources to do it. If you want to figure out energy consumption per capita, you've got. If you want to do all the, if you go into crimes, right? I track, violent crimes, property crimes, miscellaneous crimes, right? So you have, it's just a lot of fucking work. I don't think it's. I mean, if it was like Fed data, like if you want to know FBI data or Treasury data, it's up there. You can just screen scrape it. But it's not like that in the rest of the world. In some parts of the world, they cover these countries and others, and then you've got to figure out how to manage that together. So I don't think it's automatable. I think part of my chart.
So I treat this as someone's offering to help rather than saying that the technical course is infeasible. Let's just leave it at that and make it into a work stream. Whether he does it with software or with some kind of procedure, I think that anything that offloads work so that you can focus on the most important things, I think is goodness.
That would be great.
Yes.
I would love it if somebody would do that.
Yeah.
I would have
So,
to, the thing is, when I do it, I have confidence in it. So
well,
I'd
I
have,
mean, this is why you train junior staff, right?
yes, yes, okay. I understood. I understand. Thank you for clarifying.
So there's a work item for you to insert the linking here. And whoever asks this question, uh, if you're on Signal, please reach out. Oops. I just screwed this up. What I meant to do is, anyways, I'll do that later. Here's the link. All right. Question number 6. I see a bifurcation in the behaviors between the Anglo-Germanic countries that distinguishes them from the rest of the world. It goes as follows. Anglo, exhaust cooperation, reciprocity until conquest. Non-cooperation is necessary. The rest of the world, exhaust conquest, non-cooperation until cooperation, reciprocity is necessary. I may be wrong in my assertion above, and if so, let me know. Otherwise, can the panel discuss the cost of cooperation versus the benefits of non-cooperation? Are we Westerners not the product of thousands of years of extreme non-cooperation by our forefathers, the Indo-Europeans?
This is a misunderstanding of what the Anglo has been doing.
Okay, Martin's going to go. Yeah, this is Martin talking from the pulpit. Martin's going to preach now. Martin's preaching.
It is cooperation on the surface, but it's always the Anglo that dictates the condition. In their colonies, Anglos imposed free trade to foster dependency, discouraging development of industries that could actually compete with home industries, and production of monoculture in agriculture of a crop that was insufficient for subsistence. Not to say they didn't improve institutions and governments. Likewise, it didn't exactly get along with Germany when it tried to become self-sufficient, thus taking away the option to have their politics influenced via trade. Economics is war by other means, and as always, Luke's distinction of cooperation from compliance comes to mind. Can you just say no without negative consequences? On the other hand, the rest of the world doesn't necessarily fall to conquest unless it provides clear strategic advantage. War is costly and thus hardly anyone's first choice to get what they want when other means are available. It's just that they're often not.
All right, so this is like our current debate with Martin, and because Martin is very mad about the post-war effect of American introgression into Europe, and its ongoing problems, which I don't necessarily disagree with. However, the data is really clear. Would you rather be at a British colony, a French colony, a Spanish colony, Portuguese colony, or no colony? And look at the consequences for those countries. It's really obvious data. You want to be an English country. You want to have been an Anglo colony. Because if you were, you are so far ahead today compared to your competitors. And if you were not a European colony, you are so far behind, it's almost impossible to catch up. In the case
I wasn't disputing that, just
well, I'm trying to make a point.
There were selfish motives as well.
There are always selfish motives, or you wouldn't fucking do it. And there's no point in doing colonization if there isn't a selfish motive. The thing is it producing a reciprocal good? And the evidence is that it did, not in all cases, because there's sure a lot of bad examples of it. And in many cases, Africa being the best example, white people couldn't go inland without dying. And so there had to be some way of moving these things along somewhere. The second thing is these companies, the reason colonialism happened as it did and there were these issues is because there was competition between European countries for these colonies, given the resource advantage combined with the industrial advantage they had at home. So they were afraid, they did it because not only for status, not only for wealth, but because if they didn't, someone else would. And that if someone else would, it could be a danger to them because they were still in their own imperial phases. The third thing is English position on Germany was the English position on all of Europe, which was that they were trying to maintain the balance of powers at all times so that people could continue to get along and trade. Because by the time any of this happens, they've had the Smithian revolution and understanding. And their Smithian revolution understanding is that trade and interdependency is what creates peace and prosperity for all, and that causes countries to focus not on obtaining more agrarian resources through military expansion, but instead obtaining more wealth through increases in productivity and production, which could then be distributed out to these colonies in the world. So the colonies formed as demand centers. The colonies produced resources, which were brought back to the UK or all the European countries, and then sold back as finished goods. Now, the fact that everybody enjoyed making guns so that Africans could go kill more Africans and create more slaves was, not exactly any better than the English trading, playing the game of opium with China, right? This is not cool. Or the fact that the English took advantage of the historical incompetency of the Indians at being able to organize politically and militarily, and essentially abused that. And moreover, which is probably isn't understood today, is that the American colonies essentially paid for the domestication of India, and so that when they lost the colonies of America, they had India to replace the revenue with. So there's always a self-interest, but there is a difference between a self-interest that is harmful and a self-interest that is mutually beneficial. All trade of all kinds is of self-interest that is mutually beneficial, or we wouldn't have it. So I agree that my personal concern, like Martin's, is that while we had an Anglo aristocracy running the United States up until the Second War, after the Second War, the credentialist and the bureaucracy had taken over, which is what everybody was complaining about at the time, and that bureaucracy is the great threat to the Western experiment, and that not only did the bureaucracy take over, but we had the Jewish invasion after that, and the Jewish invasion sought to give justification for that by sowing division and promoting what they have promoted as sedition from within. So just like the Christians caused sedition from within Rome, or just like the communists did sedition within Russia, or the communists did sedition within China. These were not good things that the Jewish movement brought about any more than Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were good things that were brought about. They were all seditions that have, in the long term, caused harm. So if I look at this, I say, yes, Martin is right, that this woke Marxist feminist degeneracy is riding on the back of an Anglo-aristocratic strategy that was intentionally quite moral in its ambition. But now it's been co-opted so that the moral ambition is a vehicle for the immoral ambition. So that's my feeling.
My argument is that the Anglo strategy inherently carries that risk. Making everyone trade empowers the merchants. And that also you're starting the Jewish introgressionary ways because they were already very influential in the British Empire. You had Disraeli, you had influence on...
I don't disagree. What I disagree about is that is historical revision looking back at those people, we know what they were saying at the time. We know what their vision was for the time. And they believed, just like White Man's Burden, that they were going to help humanity be dragged out of
I don't dispute that they believed it. I'm saying they erred.
And wait a minute, not only did they believe it, they accomplished it. That's the thing. This bad shit may be riding on top of it. But we have, within a very short period of time, dragged all of humanity out of ignorance, superstition, starvation, poverty, hard labor.
Why are we responsible for the rest of humanity? Was it good for our people?
Well, I mean, okay, great. A, it was good for our people, but B, after World War II, it hasn't been, because we got, just like there's a great interview right now with the UK's what do you call foreign secretary to Iran? I can't remember what they call it, ambassador to Iran, and he goes off. I think something. The title of is called something like "The Failures of Western Idealism." And I think in that sense, you're correct. The way I look at it is Arianism is militaristic and expansionist. Christianity gave Arianism an excuse. Colonialism gave Arianism an excuse. And so we're playing the same stupid fucking game, right? So I agree with you on that standpoint. Is that the problem we have is we're not smart like China, India, and say, keep the fucking barbarians out. And you know what? You can't do more than this. We already own Western Europe, the North America, essentially South America, and Australia. I mean, how much more of the fucking planet do we need? I mean, the world island is a goddamn nightmare. Why do we want any of that? So I agree with you. The reason is, I'll tell you why. The reason is that the expansion in the West. Hi, Привет, Maria. She didn't say anything, did she?
No.
The expansion in the West is done by entrepreneurs, basically Vikings, which is what I want to tie back to. They're done by entrepreneurs. It's not done by states. It's done by entrepreneurs. And when the entrepreneurs are out there, the states feel an obligation to protect them. That's how expansion happened in the Western countries. It doesn't happen in like the Eastern countries where they say, or the rest of the world, where they go out and say, this is a state momentum to gather more territory. So, the reason that happens in the West is because we don't limit our people from such experiments, and it's possible we should.
My impression is that our disagreement is that you think Anglo strategy was corrupted at some point.
Yes.
Or I think due to incentive, enacting it couldn't have ended up any differently than it actually did.
It's possibly true. I would say that as long as you'll admit that it actually, as far as it went, without those negatives, it pretty much worked. It did work. It worked phenomenally.
But it creates those inevitable risks.
Okay,
and
so
I don't want those to be created in the first place.
Okay, so if your statement is we shouldn't have tried to expand it beyond our own people, I'm all in on that.
I'm also saying that I want my country, my nation, to be as little dependent on others as possible, because then others are making decisions for it.
I agree with you. How many people are in Chechnya?
10 million. I understand that we cannot be completely independent. I think those dependencies should be as close as possible, because then we have the most influence.
And what is my whole purpose behind my whole strategy here? Let 1,000 nations bloom. I agree with you.
Yeah, but I'm thinking it means something different for you and me.
Okay, so I'm going to put a pause to that because we're going down a rabbit hole.
That was a good conversation.
Well, you can have that conversation when you guys are face to face. It'll probably make you
No,
know,
because
do
we're
it
not
over a
recording
cup,
for others.
do
But
it
anyway,
over a
I
pitcher of beer
want to
or
move
something.
on. I agree to move on, but I really think that was an interesting discussion.
But there is, so somebody in the audience bring up a good point in that the this question, the cost of cooperation versus the benefits of non-cooperation, specifically what are the benefits of non-cooperation? We kind of deviated from that, didn't really answer that question.
Well, as
No,
Marcus,
that's gonna differ on case-by-case basis. Sometimes you can gain more just by clearing out the territory and taking it for itself, or for yourself.
there's
Sometimes not.
okay, so let's take that extreme. It is really beneficial to exterminate all people in a territory and populate it. It's absolutely beneficial to you to do that, and there's no case against that. I mean, it's been done a whole lot of times in history. We don't tend to repeat those stories, but it's been done over and over again. So decimation or depopulation is an extraordinarily effective strategy, but that presumes you can do it.
No, that's the point.
Huh?
That's the point. If you can do it, then it's obviously not beneficial.
Beneficial to you. Now, the problem is when you do things like that, everybody now wants to kill you. Everybody else wants to kill you.
Especially Americans.
Oh,
Or are
Jesus.
you referring to the Nazi Germans?
unless
it's Israelis, of course.
I agree with what they're doing. I'm sorry. All right. So you asked me to answer the question. If Martin will let me answer the question, I will. So ask it again. What's the benefit of not and not? Right. There is benefit of non-cooperation if there is no cooperation, productive cooperation to be had. Right. Well, the biggest problem we have in America right now is we have people who cannot cooperate because they cannot compete, and so they feel ostracized, left behind, and etc. Would it be better for those people to have their own country, so that they could compete as a group through trade, but not have to compete as participants in the same economy, right? Because that's hard on them. They're always in a disadvantageous position, and what brings down countries is always some version of inequality. So if you bring in people who can't compete at your level, you have two choices. You can degrade to their level, which is what we're doing, or you can lift them up. Give me three choices. You can try to lift them up to your level, which is called full integration, or you have to separate from them. So it's not the same is true in Israel. The same is true. That's why China is preserving their imperial structure. Russia's preserving their imperial structure. But there's nobody around America other than Mexico and down there who we can't sort of integrate with and cooperate with. I mean, we do amazing amounts of business with Mexico, and for all intents and purposes, we're running out of cheap Mexicans. And so now we're going into South America more because we've run out of cheap Mexicans.
Because
So
we lift them up such that their productivity is
what?
Because we lift them up such that their productivity is now as expensive as Americans.
Exactly. So the only problem, this is really, there's a really interesting comparison between it's a strange comparison between Mexico and Germany. Germany really needed railroads because if you go through the geography, it's actually brutal to transport stuff around them. They have rivers, but aside from that, there's mountains and all sorts of other stuff. So when you go to Mexico, their problem is they don't have rail lines, so everything has to be done on a truck. But if they have rail lines, the cost for them to transport and move goods around would be a lot cheaper. So the issue is, well, we can get a lot of cheaper goods by building railroads for them, right? Which is what we did for Africa, which we did for elsewhere. Build railroads for people because it makes cheaper goods for us, right? So in any event, I was trying to answer the question. What was the question I was trying to answer? Cooperation. So we just ended cooperation with Russia on plutonium. I mean, where do you get plutonium? You get it from Russia. Now we actually have enough here in the United States, but why are we getting it from Russia? Because it's cheaper to get it from Russia. I just think it's funny that we're cooperating with Russia on the production of nuclear weapons. We're buying the nuclear weapons raw material from Russia so we can build. I just think that the irony in that is just freaking hysterical, right? Oh, we're the problem we have now is that some of the basic components we're using for our missiles are manufactured in China, right? So we have to get that stuff out of there, right? China also owns the thing on what's called rare earth minerals. They're not rare, right? They're actually
just
not
dirty
rare.
and expensive to produce.
It's just dirty and expensive. Right? So we're cooperating with China. So I mean, cooperation is of this weird spectrum where you would say, who do you not want to cooperate with? Well, the truth is you want to cooperate with everybody that it's useful to cooperate with and not cooperate with anybody who it's unuseful. One of the things the question is, what are you cooperating on? Are you cooperating on sharing ideology? That's usually not good. Religion, I don't know about that. Gossip, rallying, shaming, undermining, sedition, treason. There's things you want to cooperate on that are mutually beneficial, and there are things that are asymmetrically harmful. So cooperation depends on that sort of the balance sheet. Is this worth it? Is this worth it? And is the flip side is it worth not cooperating? And that's really the issue. It's not so much is it worth cooperating, it's is it worth not cooperating if it's a benefit to us? But what we've learned is the issue is it strategically dependent? Then you don't do it. If it's not strategically dependent, in other words, if it's convenience or it's utility, then go ahead.
All right, I think we answered that one. All right, I think we have time for one more. Question number 7 from Elaine. When Curt says that law is the first institution of Western civilization, the state is the first institution of Chinese civilization, and religion is the first institution of Islamic civilization, what data point is he drawing on? How do we identify the dominant institution of a given group? Are we looking for particular events that demonstrate conflicts between the institutions in order to identify where the power resides? If state as first institution only preserves capital and religion as first institution only destroys capital, then how is it possible for any group that persists using these as their primary strategies, considering the amount of territory and power held by groups such as Islam and China?
This is only a partial answer. Those are general patterns, not hard rules. China is perfectly capable of copying what others are doing, if not of its own innovation. And Muslims, presumably meaning Arabs, are capable of conquest and of producing some relatively primitive infrastructure.
Yeah, I think I went along with this until the capital. That's not right. So basically, here's how you start with it. There are only 3 means of coercion. The feminine, which is seduction, care, and which scales up to be insurance and ostracization. You have the ascendant male, which we think of as trade, reciprocity, and the established male, which we think of as military dominance, force in the state, which can be used for defense, or they can be used for the production of order.
Is this accurate though? Wouldn't men commonly ascend through the military?
I didn't get that, Martin.
If it's accurate, wouldn't men actually commonly ascend through the military?
No, it's I'm putting a lot of layers into 3 points. So the feminine is constant, just like the female personality traits are constant throughout life. The male personality traits tend to move from this very adventurous, young, experimental, to the more secure, established. Because the basic problem for men is to establish capital, and the basic problem for women is to obtain access to capital through men. So this gets you three coercions. It's social, economic, and force or state. So given that those are the three means of coercion, that's really all there are. And they're basically developed specialists in these groups, and those specialists form institutions. So when you look at these governments, these historical groups, you learn which institution becomes dominant first. In the Middle East, it's religion, and states only come about as conflict over the organization of land under irrigation is necessary. If you look at China, it's got a lot of military conquest, and so it develops the state first. If you look at Europe, we start on the steppe, and as basically pirates, we call them raiders, cattle raiders. The only way to organize pirates is what we call democracy, but it's basically voluntary participation. And so these guys living on carts, right, with their cattle and their sheep and their horses and whatever else they got. They don't have pigs. You can't move pigs far fast. That's why city dwellers like pigs, which is also why the Middle East has this goofy thing with pigs, because it's really a status symbol, is that if you have pigs, it means you're poor, right? So anyway, they're dirty and you're poor. So in the West, we didn't have the ability to make a state because of some transitory experience, and we don't have people in sedentary agrarian positions, so we didn't develop religion as the first institution. We didn't have irrigation, which is really what brings religions about, is irrigation. And we don't have, so the only thing we have left is voluntary organization, which is contractualism. And what is important in contractualism? It's truth, oath, right? I'm not going to run. I'm not going to show cowardice in battle. But in exchange, since I have to supply all that risk myself, and I have to fight for it, and it's besides a cart, a horse, bronze are all expensive. That means my family's got to pay for it. I'm basically a warrior that's acting as an investment on behalf of my family, and my family's got to pay for all that shit. Well, when we go out, dude, we're going to elect you as our general because you're the best. It's not because there's some social or political nonsense to it. It's going to be because we're going to elect you. We only gave up the elective kingship, even in England, not that long ago. I mean, the only reason you really give up elective kingship is because you want to suppress the chaos whenever a king dies. I mean, that's really the reason. You've created a stable enough society that it doesn't really matter who's king, only that there is one. And so that you get into inherited monarchies simply because it's less risk of chaos given the advanced state of your country. So we developed what you would call rule of law, which is basically the only way to solve things. It's really contract, right? So rule of law, contract. The Chinese developed the state. The Middle East developed religion. Oddly, the weird thing about India's weird all the way around, is that they took the military order of the Indo-Europeans, and when in military you have ranks and responsibilities, and they actually did that into a class order of ranks and responsibilities that was intergenerational. And so you have these really weird populations in India where there are all these closed gene pools within a class, I mean a caste, right? So that people living in the same community in different castes are actually different gene pools. Really fascinating. It's insane. But unfortunately, they were never able to form a stable state. So that's why they get conquered all the time. So if you look at those three axes of coercion, you end up with three kinds of institutions. You mature into whatever first institution is first available to you. It becomes your anchoring or fundamental institution. The next institution is weaker, and the third institution is weakest of all. So in Islam or Middle East, the religion is the strongest institution. The state is weak, and law, for all intents and purposes, doesn't exist. Right? If you have China, you have the state exists. What they don't really have law. We call it law. They have command law. We have contract law. They have command law. And religion ended up being, just as in Europe, basically philosophy until they got wealthy enough that there needed an organized religion for the number of poor. The same, so they got Buddhism. So in Europe, we started out with contractualism. That led to the city, state, and the state, which maintained contractualism. And then we end up with philosophy, like Europe, like China did. Well, what's the difference? Well, China and Europe end up with aristocratic civilization down, and by two different means, right? Because their organization possible, and in Middle Eastern civilization worked from organization of priesthood peasants on up. So, and this makes a lot of sense because if you look at the demographics of the populations, I mean, the Middle East is, that's a really low IQ population compared to China and Europe. Even the minor difference between East Asia and Europe is profound in IQ, and it's less than half a standard deviation. But if you combine that with higher neoteny, you get an incredible advantage from the Asian genome. So my basic argument is get rid of too much statism, and the Japanese, the Chinese people as entrepreneurs under rule of law would like eat the world. So that's why. So I hope I've answered that. What was the question? The first institution, I've labeled the construction. There's only three means of coercion, three institutions, three institutions, three primary institutions that can found, and each civilization chose, interesting, a different thing based on their needs at the time. And unfortunately, these things become anchors. So it's not like the Middle East can escape religion, China can escape the state, or Europe can escape law, although we all seem to be trying to converge on some weird combination of the three that I'm not sure is always good. Anyway, I hope that answered that question.
That actually caused me to be curious. For civilization, this founding institution seems to be just embedded within a civilization's operating system.
Yeah,
how difficult is it to actually overcome that? I'll give you an example, right? So we talked about this many times. So in China, because state has been prevalent for as long as people remember, it is very difficult to establish a rule of law order versus rule by law, in that law is first above the state and whoever's in control of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And to the sense that I almost think it is ingrained into the Chinese psyche, maybe even at the genetic level now. So
I'm not sure. That's one of the questions I really want to know. When I talk to you, I doubt that. I doubt it's genetic. What I notice, but I can see that it would end up that way.
But I'm a very atypical Chinese.
Well, I mean, but this is the issue. You and me, I think Noah are really conscious of this. Actually, yeah. Anybody whose family was pretty up there by 1900, I think you probably can. We all sort of see the world through a certain lens, and that. But I think that, and so that's sort of similar to why if you learn basic, we call it science, Aristotelian thinking, we can all, the upper class, we get along fine. Right? I don't care. I mean, I really don't care. I mean, I don't care what race, color. Right? If we're talking logic, right, and reality, then I don't care. Um, but with the people at the bottom, that's not true, right? And so it's just a declining strategy of how dependent you are upon others. The answer to your question is it's not that obvious, but it should be when you say it, is that it's all dependent on the rise of the middle class. So if you can build a middle class, it will gradually fix the problem, right? And so the strategy is to get as many people into middle class, which is basically responsibility for capital, right? Themselves, their families, hopefully some assets, and hopefully some others, right? If you can build a middle class where all people have similar interests in treating each other as essentially customers, you will get the same behavior out of most groups. So then the question is, which groups are capable of producing a majority middle class? And that becomes, well, Easterners and Westerners. And that's just the problem. There's nobody else that can produce a middle class because they don't have the people, the demographic composition to produce a majority middle class.
I think the tragedy of China, and this is where the risk lies, is because of its geopolitics. It's once every 250 years or so, it needs to suffer a reset. And when that kind of reset happens, the conditions of producing a middle class or even the ability to sustain middle class just goes away.
Yes.
And therefore, let's hit the big reset button again. And what is the default mode? Well, we'll go back to status.
I will never complain about Chinese civilization until communism, ever. Right? I mean, it's like, fucking A, man.
That is a bad virus.
That was a very bad virus. And it really hurt the people in the civilization a lot. And so,
I mean, the Chinese complains about the Japanese.
Let's flip it around. Let's flip it around and say where the CCP or any ruling party in China is right, is that it's actually an empire, right? But it's the empire built the right way, which is through homogenization, right? So, I mean, I would say that's the case. The problem is that there are rich states and poor states, and there are really fucking poor states. And there are fucking evil barbarians on the goddamn borders, right? And so now the way the Europeans handled it is that's the Germans' problem. It's literally the way they talked about it. So there's the conversation. There's great conversation between the Pope and I can't remember, and the other heads of state. I can't remember when this happened, so forgive me. Where it's like, well, don't interfere with Germany because they have to keep the East at bay, which they meant Russia, really. But, right?
The Asiatics.
Right. And so don't interfere. And so there was this agreement not to interfere in Germany, right? Which is why we still had this weird coastal thing, right? And then we have Germany. Germany was trying to expand trade and basically expand the revolutionary, the agrarian, commercial, financial revolution into Eastern Europe, right? And it was succeeding. Although if you look at, I'm very conscious of this because I have some experience with Estonia, is how the Saxons were the Jews, right? I mean, they're just as bad, right? Just as bad. And so you have this problem of these financial guys creating their own little place inside a city and then doing all the financing, whatever, but they were not, and they did make the local regions wealthier. That's not untrue. It's just that they had a little too much selfish ambition there regarding the people. So, so anyway, oh shit, I've lost my train of thought because I wanted to go down that rat hole. Uh, anyway, so yeah, you get this leave Germany alone, and so that worked pretty well. But for when you're China, you've got this problem of who's there to leave, who's there to keep the East at bay, the West at
I
bay.
think in the Tang Dynasty, they tried to import some Westerners.
Yes.
Even in, I provide them a poor history of. I'm a poor student of Chinese history because I basically slept through all those
Why
classes.
is that funny to me? Every time I think this is funny.
Well, I find it funny myself because history used to be my worst subject, and I really hated it because none of the
Really?
dates and stuff, none of that shit makes sense. And now I'm fascinated by it. Only
Yes,
I've kind
yes,
of
it's
passed
true.
a stage where you still learn from school, which is actually maybe a good thing. But during the Tang Dynasty, which was the most globalized dynasty in Chinese history, a lot of the aristocracy, so I learned, were actually Westerners because of the ability to, basically wield heavier weapons and so on. And so I guess the Chinese did try that, but then I don't know what it's called in English, but there was a period of civil war, and it's actually led by this Turkish general, or at least one of the rebels. I guess that kind of put a kibosh on that, and ever since then, it's never happened. Ever since then, it's either Chinese get conquered by foreigners, Mongolians, and the Manchurians, but never quite leveraging them. So I think the answer to your question is we got to import a bunch of Germans and position them on the western provinces, make it into a independent state or something to keep the barbarians at bay.
There's, the problem for China is it hasn't reached that middle class stage, which is what I was seeing happening prior to this fucking expansionist bullshit this moron is brought in onto the. I mean, you couldn't be doing better than China was doing. All they had to do was not play this imperialist bullshit, right? And they would have been fine. The world was like it's like Putin before 214. He was on the fucking Time magazine. He was the best politician in the world. If you don't, that's all that blew it is these two things. It makes me nuts. So in any event, the Chinese are doing the right thing, but it would be necessary to form a pretty strong equivalent of the U.S.'s military, right? That was federal, right? But that everything else was delegated out to the regions, and I think that would work fine. But the problem is defending China from introgression, and before the people have completed their transition out of subsistence poverty is just necessary. I understand that.
So you say that, but you don't know how hard it is, or next to the impossibility, for any Chinese leadership to do that. Because historically, every time you delegate powers to the provinces, you end up in chaos.
Right, but what does chaos mean?
Chaos meaning these provinces compete with each other, local warlordism, etc. It's just
right.
Because I mean, there's so many repeated histories in history. There's so many repeated cases in history. I don't think any Chinese leadership can be in the position they are and make that kind of decision, right? Because by definition, they got to where they are by centralization of power. They climbed the hierarchy into the centralized power to become the emperor, and you're not going to delegate it down to the provinces. It's counter to the Chinese psyche.
Okay, so I would say that's true because again, it's hard to get this. For some reason, we think of formal institutions as the goal instead of informal institutions as the goal. In other words, the great purpose of formal institutions is producing informal institutions. It's not the formal institutions themselves. It's the informal institutions. But if you produce the informal institution of the middle class, right, that's what drives all the positive behaviors. And so until those provinces can reach that point where there's an emerging middle class, because that's why we screwed up with blacks in America, is relocating them to cities so that they could do Marxist relocation and take the cities down. So if we took those blacks out of, they were developing their own financial networks, their own middle class. They were doing fine. So we blew that. So this is the same thing in China. I would say I don't care how China's built until it gets there, because you do need strong centrality to get you there, until the informal institutions can take over the regulation and control from the formal. But so all you're saying is it's going to take another 30 or 40 years. The problem is,
which according to our friends, what if all his China probably doesn't have.
Well, it doesn't have, because they did this stupid fucking thing. I just, here's how I look at this. I listen to a bunch of China, and I can't remember what the one Chinese guy. I absolutely love this man. He's so fucking hysterical. His name is escaping me. I listen to Lee and whatever, a bunch of them. So the way I look at it is, look, it's the same thing that Russia has a problem with Ukraine. A democratic Ukraine that's prosperous immediately invalidates a Russia. A prosperous Taiwan that's democratically run invalidates the Communist Party. Right? That's right. And so they're just afraid of that. Okay, great.
It's a democracy in a sense that it's all over the West, where people's vote don't actually matter at all.
That may be true, but in those cases, even if the people's opinion doesn't matter, the government has to serve the people more so than themselves, or they'll be kicked out. I mean, if only thing matters.
They serve less the people than under authoritarian regimes, because they have pretense that people voted for them.
Okay, so let me flip it around. They have rule of law in Taiwan, and they don't have it in China, right? That would be enough. So in any event, and because they have rule of law, see, the whole thing is you can only get anywhere if you have rule of law, because rule of law means capital is safe. If capital is safe, then it can be invested. It can be invested, it can produce multiples. So you have to have rule of law to produce it. Now, that's why I say it's not, we talk about democracy all the time, but it's actually rule of law that matters. Right? Democracy is only valuable whether if it's throw the bums out or no, I'm not paying for that. Because it's not clear that people know anything more than that. So I don't see I see China, his only problem is this fucking guy is going on an arrogant expansionist effort to leave a personal mark on history as some fucking imperial champion, instead of the goddamn country was just flying, and it was flying for some bad reasons, which was the real estate and overinvestment and structural building, whatever. But it didn't matter if that was getting the people to where they needed to be, which was property owning, majority middle class, whatever. So I think China could have been fine if it were not for this guy.
To some degree, I wonder if a rise of a she or she-like character is just deterministic in that system.
Well, because the power,
because of the way it's set up.
Well, I mean, this is the problem with having. It's like if you have a big government with all these people have to conform, you're just setting yourself. I mean, first of all, having a lot of people is bad, because what's happening is you're passing the point at which you can reach consensus. You might want to have layers of people, like there's a local group, a regional group, a province group, the federal group, right? And then the equivalent of a Senate, right? You have all those things because things can boil up. But when you make this this ideologically rigorous thing, it's just very hard to see how that can work without producing the power based on coercion. It's just very hard to see it because coercion is the only thing that can work. All right, I think we're done, aren't we?
Yeah, we are done with that. And if you could give a plug-in for the convention that's coming up.
Okay, so we have our summer convention. It's in Bellevue, Washington. You could say Seattle, but it really doesn't make any difference because they're basically organically attached. So we're in Bellevue on June 14th through 16th.
Friday or Sunday.
Sorry?
From June 14th, Friday to 16th Sunday.
Right. And what's our theme, Francis?
Well, the war against the West. How it can
the war against the West. I think what we originally were going to was the feminine war against the West or something of that nature.
The pathological female. But the pathological female really is just it manifests itself in the war against the Western civilization.
Right. So we're going to talk a lot about the pathological female in the context of the war against the West.
It's not even pathological female; it's pathological expression precisely in the sense that it's in conflict with our group strategy.
Correct. All right. So I'm Curt Doolittle. This is Francis Sue and Martin Steffen, and thank you for watching. I hope you got something out of this. This would make a bunch of really good shorts. We got to pay somebody to make shorts out of these things because they're quite good. Martin, your answers were rock solid today. Thank you. Francis, you're as usual a great leader. Thanks